Hello, good evening, and welcome to 30 Days of Doctrine. It's good to have you here. So today, we want to progress from where we ended yesterday. Yesterday, I was trying to bring a very important point after our manuscript evidence, another point to verify, to point us to the truism of scriptures, to say that it's impossible that the Bible is a forgery. It's literally historically impossible that the Bible was a 5th century, forgery by, some people in the Catholic Church. Is illogical. And that's for a couple of factual reasons. We talked about the manuscript evidence, which you can, look up that video. We went ahead to talk about, we talked about the geographical accuracy, right? I remember that from yesterday. We talked about geographical accuracy. We talked about one other thing yesterday. I'm trying to remember, but then today this is what's been on my mind. We need to add more to that. I told you there are 7 of them. I think we've successfully done 3, about 3 or so. But there was one I was unable to do yesterday. It's called embarrassing testimony. Let me explain the concept. For you to get the context of what I'm doing, you have to have watched previous videos. So you need to go back and watch previous videos. At very least, the video series on reliability, the reliability of scriptures, why the Bible is reliable, so you can get the context of what I'll be doing today. So embarrassing testimony, yeah? When we talk about embarrassing testimony, we're not again talking about a theological concept, but a historic concept, right? We're talking about something that applies to how we know what happened in history. It's the same thing with every region. One very important thing that historians look out for in your document that seems to present historical account of an event or a person is embarrassing testimony. The more the embarrassing testimony, the likelihood for it to be true. What's embarrassing testimony? It is sharing a perspective of you that you are not likely to want to share. Do you get that? I'll give you an example. So there was a war between Nigeria and what do I call it now? Biafra, of course. The eastern states, most eastern states of Nigeria, led by a person called Ojukwu, a couple of years ago, decades ago. Now, this war was it was a major event. It's called the Civil War in the Nigerian space. It's taught in schools and all that. Now, if I am Nigeria and I want to give a narrative of the Civil War, what do you think I'm going to say? That a couple of states teamed up and they kept me, I was warring with like 5 states, 7 states, I don't know now. I can't remember how many, for like 2 years, 3 years. Do I want to create the impression that their effort really meant so much? Or do I want to create the impression that, they just tried to be rebellious and we shut it down, we had everything in order, we had the nation calm? Wouldn't that be Nigeria speaking? So if you want to have the first narrative, what would it sound like? We threatened, we shut down, do you get? Every perspective, every region is going to propagate a perspective of them, an ideology, not just an ideology, a view, a superior view of them, of themselves, right? They are going to try to make themselves, stainless, spotless. Let me think of more examples. This is a very regular concept. It's a logical thing that we can all get and we can all relate to it. You don't want to tell the story if a class teacher and a student fights. The class teacher doesn't want to tell the story as though it was a fight or as though he was beaten, even though he was beaten. If he was thoroughly beaten, he would want to. So there was a fight. That's his story. If he was thoroughly beaten, the student is going to go outrightly to say, do you get? Especially when he's not telling the story to the school authority, of course. He's telling the story to his friends and say, I beat the guy. But if he's telling the story if the scenario was that there was actually a fight. Or it doesn't even rise up to the dignity of being of qualifying as a fight. Let's assume what happened was that this guy challenged the teacher. The teacher hit him physically. He tried to hit back, and then he got beaten. He's going to claim that there was a fight. Meanwhile, there probably was no fight. He just got beaten. So you see that every perspective is going to try to present itself as somewhat correct, superior. But when you have a correct historic document, it necessarily has to contain embarrassing testimony. Now, I want to make a side comment, which is very important. You're going to hear this come up time and time again, and probably you've been told this, that in Egypt, in all of Egypt's historical records, that there is no record of the Israelites coming around and then being subdued, and then Moses showing up to 10 plagues showed up, the 10th plague being the death of all firstborns, and then from there, Pharaoh was pommeled into letting the children of Israel go, and then they even tried to pursue, and many of them drowned in the Red Sea. How would you think that would sound if Egypt was talking about Egypt, and they told you that people that were armless, slaves, showed up and disarmed an entire empire, disarmed a group of people that were known for their military might, that were known for their intellectual strength, for their wizardry prowess, for whatever, Egypt is fondly regarded as the, hub of civilization in the then world. You would imagine that Egypt would want to always portray itself as the world power, the powerful guys. So are you likely to find such an embarrassing testimony of Egypt written by Egypt? You see that? So it is little wonder. It's not actually, no, you cannot use that to prove that Moses did not actually exist, and then there was no conquest of Egypt in the way the Bible puts it as conquest, not that there was a war, but then God showed up and by his miraculous sign delivered Israel out of Egypt. You can't claim that did not happen simply and only because it is not in the history record of Egypt. Because it's not supposed to be. It's less likely to be. Why? Because that's an embarrassing testimony. You can only have embarrassing testimony if you have a very neutral, a very unbiased, and indeed a true account of a scenario. That's when you can have. So imagine you have a third party narrating Biafra war. He's not speaking as Nigeria. He's not speaking as Biafra. I've read books about the Biafra war on both sides. All right. The Biafrans tried to make it look like, they were at the verge of being a nation, that some nations have even acknowledged that they were a nation. Nigerians tried to make it look like, they had it all in place. It was just an insurgency. It was just some rebellion, and they got it fixed. But you see that when you have a third party who does not share with either of their sentiments, he is going to communicate, is more likely to communicate from a more neutral point of view. And this is what you have in scripture. Embarrassing testimony. Think about it. If in the then culture, women were so tolerated, they were so, less valued, devalued, they were treated like, irrelevant people. If that was the culture that was prevalent, which of course is historically correct, that was the culture, what do you think was going to be the credit it gives to the story of scripture that women were now the first people ever outside the guards to have seen Jesus risen from? Do you know how important the resurrection of Jesus is to all of his ministry and message? If Jesus did not rise from the dead, all he said could just pass for every other normal person that has showed up in history and had claimed to be something mighty. The resurrection of Jesus from the dead is like the focal point, the most pivotal, central, key point of his ministry. That if it is true that what he said is true, then an endorsement of God on him to say that he is truly true was to raise him from the dead, showing that he is beyond human as he claimed. So the resurrection was the crux, the climax, the apogee of the ministry of Christ. And the first people to bear witness of that resurrection were women, even though in the culture, the testimony of women were treated as the testimony of children. That's, if you're going to forge a story, if this story is not true, that thing should not exist there. It's a very crazy thing that you want to propagate this kind of ideology to a Jew, and you are using a woman as the conveyor of that narrative. You are just discrediting your story from the beginning. Do you get the point? So it's one of the strongest embarrassing in the context of their culture as it existed in that day. That the most authentic source you want to use to communicate something you regard as hallowed information would be a man, would be a well-known man in society. So craft this story in such a way that one hallowed man is going to be passing by the tomb, and then Jesus is, sitting somewhere with his leg crossed, and they say, do you recognize me? So, the man else could say, yeah, I'm risen. So he just goes to Pontius Pilate. He just goes to Herod. He goes to this, and he just breaks the news. Even Herod may have believed. But you see, they were women. That's not credit. Given their culture, that was not credit. That was very embarrassing testimony. That's one. Think about the fact that if it were possible that Paul and Peter and the rest of them sat down to create a forgery, because first of all, it's not possible that this is not an ancient document. Carbon dating and manuscript evidence proves that beyond reasonable doubt. So you may now say, okay, it's an ancient document, but how about Peter and Paul and the apostles sitting down to say, you know what, let's create something. Let's just create this story. Let's complete this story. And guess what? In their completion of the story, as Peter being the lead apostle now, the chief apostle, they now included a space where Peter, the lead apostle, denied Jesus. Do you know the weight of that? That after following him for 3.5 years, the time when he was going to suffer his passion, the time when he was going to die, you now denied him. Is that supposed to be credit? How many pastors come to tell you that they lost their faith, they denied Christ, and they now repented? I mean, what authority would Peter even have if he was going to create this story and sell? Would it look like a good deal for him? Would it look like he had so much authority after now if he comes on the scene and says, I denied Jesus by the threat of a girl, couldn't stand, suffering with him, and then he now comes years after and he's saying to you, suffer for Jesus. Said it's the trial of your faith, blah, 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 that though you're passing through fire, it's refining you, it's testing you, it's working patience in you and all of that. Peter, excuse me, teach me about trial of faith. No, I remember. It was not too long. Your faith was tried now. Have you forgotten the rooster? Have you forgotten the crying, the what's it called? Not crying, it's crowing of the cock. The cock crowed. Right? Am I correct? Do you still remember that? So that was the sound that convicted Peter. That Peter was coming to teach you about, think about it, about the trying of your faith. So if that story was a forgery, why did you need to include that part? I mean, why? What was going to be the utilitarian value of the denial of Peter, the denial of Jesus by Peter, who was now going to show up and emerge as the lead apostle? This goes to prove that the Bible is a historically reliable document because it contains an immense, reasonable quantity of embarrassing testimony that you see within it, even the key players showing you their wounds. Imagine Paul, who was going to write 2/3 of the New Testament, and guess how the story started? He was a persecutor. Killed, persecuted, and made life difficult for Christians. And that Paul was now the one that was going to now be spreading the lie that they formed of them to say, let's create this story. Why do you think they want to make themselves object of, the lead guys, object of possible mockery? Oh, you even supervised the killing of Saul, of Stephen. What authority do you have to speak to me about Jesus? Oh, you that denied Jesus in front of a little girl. What authority do you have to speak to me about persecution? So what was the logical point why they will now present themselves in that light before now coming to the end of saying, oh yeah, after we went through this, we now came to believe, and then we are now asking you to believe, even though when we're faced with those things, we could not stand it. Well, we're asking you to stand trial. Do you get? That's not the way to start a story. That's not the way to create a forgery. So this embarrassing testimony, you can read this up elsewhere. It's a very strong point as to how we can know historically reliable documents, how we can know things that are written from a neutral point of view, a non-interest point of view, something that is not, you are not really trying to create a perspective, a one-sided perspective to this. You are trying to give a sincere flow. You're trying to give an account, a pure historical account of what happened. There necessarily, most times, would have to be the presence of embarrassing testimony, and you find this abundantly in Scripture. Think of Moses, think of stammering, think of Aaron, think of speaking against Moses, think of the leprosy of Miriam, think of all the things that happened to the icons of Scripture. Embarrassing testimony. It goes ahead to prove, it adds to the point, to prove the truism of Scripture. And tomorrow, I'll be building on this by talking about, a different part of this. There are about 3 more points to go. Archaeological evidence is coming. You can't beat that. So stay with me, 9:30 p.m. tomorrow. Let's continue this series. Thank you for joining in. Do have a great evening. You can drop your comments, drop your questions. I'll be there to answer. God bless you.